Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Clapp, president and co-founder of FRAXA Research Foundation. And for those of you who don't know, I have a son, Andy, who has Fragile X. He's 31 now. And my husband, Mike Tranfalia, and I have been working with FRAXA since 1994. When Andy was 2.5 years old. And much of that time, we've also worked with Dr. Mark Baer, who I'm really thrilled to be talking with this morning. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Katie. Great to be with you.
When we first met you, Mark, you had a FRAXA postdoctoral fellowship for Dr. Kim Huber, who was a postdoc in your lab at Brown University. And that was quite a while ago, and actually 1999.
Yeah.
And now
Andy was 10.
Andy was 10. And I believe that Mike and I first met you at the 2000 neuroscience meeting when you were very, very excited about the mGluR5 results that you and Kim and others in your lab had gotten. So here we are in 2020, and many people will remember the Arbaclofen story, but some don't know about it. So can you tell us what's happened, what the big news is and the big excitement is today with Arbaclofen?
Yeah, I think the big news is that we've resurrected Arbaclofen. And after quite a long hiatus, unfortunately, you may recall that a number of clinical trials were performed with Arbaclofen, each one informing the next. And we were starting to focus in on having a better understanding of the drug and understanding of what symptoms of Fragile X would respond to the drug and what doses would be required. And we felt like we were really teed up to have a great success in Fragile X. And unfortunately, we ran out of money, quite simply. It was on the backdrop of the global recession of the 2007, 2008, and we ran out of money. And the drug program was given safe harbor by a organization called Clinical Research Associates that was a spinoff of the Simons Foundation. And they've been holding on to it, but not taking it forward, certainly not in Fragile X. And so we've been trying since then, over the past 7 years, to come up with a strategy in which we could take it back and take it forward in Fragile X. And I'm sad to say it took us 7 years, but we now have it. We've created an entity called Allos Pharma, a virtual company, to take in the license and to carry it forward, hopefully through FDA approval for Fragile X.
And that's really exciting because I'll never forget all the families who were in that trial of Arbaclofen and the ones who continued taking Arbaclofen after the double-blind portion of the trial was ended, and how much they felt that the drug was helping. So what happens now? What are next steps? And what's your immediate goal with Arbaclofen?
Well, our immediate goal is to try to pick up where we left off 7 years ago. It's not that easy because it's been 7 years and things are scattered. But the number one objective is to assemble the materials required to go before the FDA to get guidance on what's required to see the drug approved in Fragile X. So that's our number one near-term objective.
So will that have changed a lot from 7 years ago? I mean, is there a lot that you'll need to do to go to the FDA to get that first step?
I don't have that much experience with the FDA personally. Usually I was left out of those meetings because I'm an academic basic scientist. But I do believe that that in a way, much has been learned about Fragile X, since you have to remember that Seaside was perhaps the first to launch registration trials in Fragile X, and there was much to learn
Mhm.
about how to conduct a trial, what would be the appropriate endpoint to measure a benefit, what would be the right patients, and so on. And so I think that the community at large has matured a lot in terms of understanding the challenges of clinical trials, negotiating with the FDA on endpoints that can demonstrably improve the quality of life for the individual with Fragile X and the family. So I think that a lot of it hasn't been, this downtime has not been entirely wasted, shall we say. I mean, there have been a number of other clinical trials that not necessarily having a smashing success, but with every one, we learn something more. So I think we're well positioned now to go before the FDA and present our case.
Yes, in the last 7 years, there have been trials that have been conducted and designed in different ways, and I really do think that we've learned a lot since 7 years ago. And even back then, the trial was close to succeeding, wasn't it?
It was agonizingly close. And, I can only say to the families who were, profoundly disappointed when the Arbaclofen program ended, that I very much share in that disappointment and that feeling. I mean, that this was a tragic, loss of a potentially very helpful medication. And so, I can't remember the question, Katie, but I just know that it was extremely painful
We were so
for
close.
us. Oh,
And
right. Oh, that
if
was the question. How close did we come?
yeah, how
I'll tell you how close we came.
was
Thank
it?
you for reminding me. It's been 20 years. The brain's not the same, but
Only 7 years since that trial.
that's
20
true.
years of effort.
20 years since we started in Fragile X.
Yes.
No, so yes, as I said, with every clinical trial, we learn something. And some of these things seem mundane, like what's the right dosing schedule? What's the right duration of dosing to see a benefit? What are the right measures of benefit? And so with every trial, we learn something. And I think that to me, what was so sickening really was that in the very last trial we did, which was in children with Fragile X, we very clearly saw a signal. We achieved a statistically significant improvement. We came within a hair of what would be required to get FDA approval based only on those data. And unfortunately, because of the financial constraints, we were unable to fully enroll that trial. So we lost some statistical power that had we had it, we feel pretty confident we might have actually already gotten over the bar.
So
with
you
that
really
one trial.
were close in the children.
We were very, very close. Yes.
Do you think that this next trial will be in children if that was the one that showed the best signal, or is it too?
Yes, I do. I think that we now, again, I think a lot of our trials previously, we were casting a broad net. We didn't really know what would be the best patient population and endpoint and so on. And I think now we saw very clearly a strong signal in children. So we will definitely start in children.
Mhm. So actually, what does Arbaclofen do, and how did you come across it? I should remember this, but how did this first come up in Fragile X research?
Well, that's an interesting story. So first, the simple answer is, what does Arbaclofen do? So in the brain, the major inhibitory neurotransmitter is a compound called gamma aminobutyric acid, or otherwise known as GABA. So just called GABA. And GABA acts on two different classes of receptor that are on neurons in the brain. One of them is, without getting too technical, a GABA-gated ion channel called a GABA-A receptor. And the other is what's called a metabotropic receptor, not a metabotropic glutamate receptor, but a metabotropic GABA receptor. And that's what the GABA-B receptor is. It's a metabotropic GABA receptor. And the effects of GABA on these two different receptors types varies. But one of the things that it does for sure is it dampens excitability in the brain. So that's sort of the textbook answer of what a GABA-B receptor is. And Arbaclofen is an agonist. So it's a compound that mimics GABA, but it acts only on the GABA-B receptor. So when someone's administered Arbaclofen, what we're really doing is increasing what you might call the tone of GABA-B receptor activation. So you're jazzing up the GABA-B receptors, and you're not touching the GABA-A receptors.
Making them more effective.
Exactly. Exactly. And so the origins of Arbaclofen as a potential treatment for Fragile X are quite interesting. Serendipity, really, as is the case in most psychiatric drug discovery. And it really comes from anecdotal reports of an improvement in behavior of severely autistic individuals treated with baclofen, which is a closely related molecule to Arbaclofen, treated with baclofen for the control of gastroesophageal reflux. So otherwise known as GERD. So GERD is common in individuals with autism. And of course, there are a number of medical treatments that are tried to control GERD that some people may take, like Prilosec or other things like that. But when these drugs don't work, then the next line of the next place to go is with baclofen. And what was observed is that baclofen was having beneficial effects on behavior. So essentially less irritability, calming effect on behavior. And so I was aware of this because I have conversations with parents that observed this. And I just tucked it away in my brain as an interesting observation. I wasn't quite sure how to connect it with Fragile X. And then I will say, I remember quite vividly the eureka moment that I had, which I realized suddenly why this made sense in the context of Fragile X. And so in Fragile X, let me give you a little, give you a primer on Fragile X. No, that's ridiculous. But what we know from basic science is that there are a number of consequences of the loss of FMRP in Fragile X. And one of them is just, misdirected wiring early in development that may be beyond the reach of a therapy initiated late. A second is altered function of specific ion channels that control the excitability of neurons. those are sufficiently diverse and idiosyncratic that it's not clear that any one treatment would be effective to target those effects. But the last class of mechanism, and the one that actually gave rise to the mGluR theory and so on, is altered protein synthesis regulation by neurons in the brain. And the brief story on that is that we had found that the protein synthesis in neurons that is regulated by metabotropic glutamate receptors is exaggerated in Fragile X, and that this is quite widespread. And that's what gave rise to the theory that maybe if we dampen down signaling, we could improve many different symptoms of the disease. Now, metabotropic glutamate receptors are activated by the release of glutamate by excitatory neurons in the brain. Well, it turns out that GABA B receptors are found on the glutamate nerve terminals. They're found elsewhere as well, but they're found definitely on glutamate nerve terminals. And so we thought, gee, maybe arbaclofen's having the effect similar to mGluR5 inhibitors of dampening down this excessive protein synthesis. So that was the wild idea. Of course, we rushed back to the lab, and these experiments were done at Seaside. And indeed, that's what we observed, was that the exaggerated protein synthesis was corrected as well by arbaclofen as it was by inhibitors of mGluR5, and that many of the other phenotypes in the mice that responded to mGluR5 inhibitors would also respond to arbaclofen. So that's the slightly technical explanation for how this happened.
So tucked away in your answer is the idea that maybe many people with Fragile X will need a combination of approaches, of treatments. What do you think about that? Do you think that's where we're going, where we're headed with treatment?
Well, I guess I would first say that based on our experience in the clinic with arbaclofen, we don't think a combination is necessary to see an improvement. So we are quite optimistic that we will see substantial benefit with arbaclofen alone. But that is not to say that there may be additional benefits conferred by adding on other medications that are targeting different elements of this signaling pathway. So, I mean, I think it's good news, really, because when you talk about combinations, there are many permutations, and you won't even necessarily know what's the right combination to start with. It's obviously much better if you have a monotherapy that's working, and then you can say, now let's see what happens if I add on an inhibitor of this enzyme or of this neurotransmitter receptor and so on, and maybe expand the nature of the benefit.
Well, it's very exciting. And I guess I would want to ask one last question, which is, what can we do? What can FRAXA do? And what can the community do to make sure that another 7 years doesn't go by?
Yes, thank you for asking. I think that, one of the things that you and I had discussed was sort of what took 7 years? Why did it take so long to get this out? And I will just simply say it was not for lack of trying. Many times we tried to, get a license to arbaclofen and move it forward. And the real short answer to what took so long was lack of funding. It takes a special kind of investor to support this kind of activity. And we, as I say, we had some glimmers of hope for quite some time. And finally, I think on the third try, we have decided we're just doing this at risk. At this point, we are not funded to do this, but we feel like time was running out. And so we've taken the license at risk. We formed a company at risk. And so,
Being at risk.
if we would welcome investments, I would say that.
Uh-huh.
We would welcome investments or spread the word that this is a really good cause. And I think for not an enormous amount of money, we might be able to see it all the way across the finish line.
It does take an enormous amount of money to go from where this is to through the huge trials that the FDA requires to the market, even in rare diseases. It's just mind-blowing. FRAXA has raised or funded over 30 million, but that's not enough, is it? Not for one big trial.
Amazingly, yes. And I think FRAXA has been, as you know, I'm an enormous fan of FRAXA. And I think that FRAXA has leveraged their money, the money that's raised, in a very effective way by attracting, hundreds of scientists to work in Fragile X. And, many of the exciting discoveries that are pointing the way towards therapeutics have come thanks to FRAXA's wise investment in grid science. But it is true that at some point you cross from, it's well known in pharma that the science is the inexpensive part of the process, and that once you go into a clinical trial, the costs really mount. We don't, I will only say that we're not starting from scratch. So the fact is that we have conducted a number of phase 2 and phase 3 trials with Fragile X. So we are not starting from ground zero. We're not launching a brand new program. We know a lot about this drug, and one of the most important things we know about it is that it's very safe. So it's not the same as what's called a novel chemical entity, some more exotic molecule that may have more value to an investor because it is exotic and it'll have a patent life. But it's also an unknown as to how safe it will be, particularly with chronic administration. With respect to Arbaclofen, we are very, very comfortable with the safety of this compound. It's very well known. We already know from our previous work that we had been probably too conservative in pushing the dose. We saw no untoward effects at the highest doses that were used, and we were right on the threshold of a great therapeutic effect. So we know what to do, and that will save a lot of money.
Here we go. Yes.
So we're not really at the exploration phase right now. We're at the execution phase.
Hopefully the last phase.
I pray.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. And we appreciate all your work and all this time. And it's really been a lot of fun working with you and brainstorming with you, and looking forward to a lot more.
Well, I promise I'll keep trying as long as I can till we see a success.
Thank you, Mark.
All right. Thank you, Katie. And thank you, FRAXA.